Good afternoon or good morning, depending on the time zone that you're in. My name is Jonathan Schoonover, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Strategic Practice for Tennesseans for Quality Early Education. I also serve as the Director for the Bright Start Tennessee Network, and I'm happy to welcome you to another Lunch and Learn that we have, Bright Start Tennessee Lunch and Learn. Today, we are excited to bring to you kind of an update on our data dashboard that is now live and going, and many of you are already using fully with the work that you're doing across the state with our Bright Start work. Just as a quick reminder that Tennesseans for Quality Early Education is a nonpartisan coalition of advocates for Tennessee's youngest learners. We exist essentially to advance state policies and practices to ensure that all Tennessee children from birth all the way through third grade get the high quality care and education that they need to power our state's future. As a part of that, we've created this Bright Start Tennessee network, which serves as a statewide network of community partnerships looking at closing achievement opportunity gaps for children from birth through third grade. And as a part of that, we've now grown. There's 8 communities across the state that are working on either implementing or continuing to develop or for the first time develop early care and education plans for their community. And as a part of that, we know that to get to third grade proficiency in reading and math, that it takes all 3 of these domains kind of functioning at full capacity. And so that's the high quality birth through age 8 learning environments. It's physical health, mental health, and development all being on track beginning at birth. And then it's supported and supportive families and communities. This is furthermore broken down into 5 measures of success for each of these 3 domains, giving us 15 measures of success. The data dashboard, we usually kind of talk about what the topic of the day covers, and the data dashboard covers all of these. And so you're going to see a little bit about how we provide the data for here and a little bit of background on what that looks like. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. And would love to just kind of welcome our guests. These are repeat guests. I think it's one of our first repeat national guests that we have the luxury of bringing in. But Carlise and Gabby are both serve at the Early Childhood Data Collaborative with Child Trends, and have come to become friends as well as colleagues in this process. And it's been great to kind of work with them throughout the process, building the data dashboard and then refining it and continue to make it better as we kind of work in this area. So with that said, I will stop. I'll stop yammering on and I'll pass it over to Carlise. And I'll share. You can share your screen. And I'll spotlight you and Gabby as we kind of move from here.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction and for inviting us back because I think it's been about a year, but we enjoyed. Am I still muted?
Oh, you're good.
No. Okay, great. Wonderful. And thanks for having us back. So, good afternoon. Again, my name is Carlise King, and I'm the Executive Director for the Early Childhood Data Collaborative at Child Trends, or what we like to call ECDC. And ECDC focuses on policies and practices that promote the use of early childhood data to inform policy. So specifically, we focus on strategies to build stronger early childhood data infrastructures that really help to answer questions policymakers may have about the best way to meet the needs of children and families. I am excited to be joined by my colleague, Gabrielle Guerra, a senior analyst at Child Trends who's part of our research team and has worked to provide consultation along with myself to QQEE to develop the statewide early childhood data dashboard. So before we start, I just want to acknowledge our funder, the Alliance for Early Success. The foundation provides funding for national organizations like Child Trends to be able to provide free consultation to states and communities that are part of their network. So I've included their website if you'd like to learn more about the Alliance and their work. So for the Lunch and Learn today, I will first share some updates that have been made to the dashboard. While Gabby and I are presenting, Jonathan and Jasmine will likely be chiming in throughout as they have been really the key drivers of this work. Next, I'll share some tips that we've developed about communicating data equitably. using some of the data from the Bright Start dashboard as examples. And then we will end with my colleague Gabby sharing some of the data gaps that we're trying to fill in the dashboard and future directions of the dashboard with some key steps Jonathan and team are taking. So most important, we'd love to hear from you, your questions and how you've been using the dashboard and anything else that you would like to share. So to start off, I'm going to highlight some changes to the data dashboard. So there are three main changes I want to point out. One of the things is that the dashboard has received a refreshed look and design. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the icons, the colors. It looks great. One of the things that have been added in the new design on the second panel you'll see is a summary page that shows all of the indicators and measures of success that Jonathan referenced on one page. So this would give you the opportunity to have an overview statewide by region or by a county of how well children and families are doing on all of the measures of success, and then click in to kind of go deeper. And then the last change is that there is a new feature that allows you to create PDFs of any of the data and the tables within the dashboard. So this is a good opportunity to download it to share with others or to embed it in other presentations you may be doing. So next, I'm going to give a high-level overview of our tips for communicating data equitably, thinking through examples from the dashboard. We touched on this briefly in our last presentation, but for this one, I'm just going to go a little deeper and provide more examples of how to apply each of the tips that we have. So before I go into the tips, I always like to emphasize the importance of thinking about who your audience is first for any data that you're communicating. We often talk with clients about how to communicate the data that they collect. A data dashboard is one of many ways that data can be communicated. And communicating your data depends on your audience, the type of data you're communicating. And in the case of TQEE, when we first met, they really wanted to share their data so that it could be used by policymakers, the Bright Start partnerships, and other practitioners. The purpose of the dashboard is not necessarily to have the partners address every single measure that's in the dashboard, but it's to give the community a common tool and language around what helps children succeed, so that policymakers can track statewide trends to inform potential policy solutions, such as increased funding to scale up effective practices or policy changes that might prioritize different types of interventions or populations that are being served. And that the Bright Start partnerships could use the data to help develop strategic plans on how to direct and align services in your communities and to meet the multiple needs of children and families. And then last, that practitioners could use the dashboard to improve the effectiveness of their programs using information around children in their community to think about their outreach as well as the design of their programs. So we have a resource, and I'll share this with Jonathan so we can send it around. But often when we talk about our guidelines for communicating data equitably, we sort of boil them down into these three tips. What first is saying what you mean, using person-centered language. The second is not centering one type of person as the norm when communicating data. And the last is to always put data in context when communicating your data to different audiences. In the following slides, I'm going to go into more detail about what this means for each of these tips. So the first guideline, saying what you mean, requires asking ourselves, who are we really talking about when we're presenting any data? So diverse, for example, means varied, but it's often used as a euphemism for something that's somehow different from the US norm, or it could be not white, not American, not sort of in this, again, general idea of what the norm is that we probably haven't explicitly stated. Rather than using euphemisms like vulnerable or marginalized, We recommend that you be specific about who you're actually talking about and who is and who isn't included in your data. So that means, for example, when saying children of color, if we're really only talking about Black and Hispanic children, we should say that. And we shouldn't say Black children if what we really mean in the data that we're sharing is that we're talking about Black children whose parents earn less than a certain income. And we should be specific about what income that is. So saying that we can, by saying these things and being more explicit, we're one, being clear about the populations that we're focusing on, but we're also saying it also says something revealing about limitations in some of our data. So if Indigenous children weren't included in the data, then it's important that we acknowledge that. Another piece of saying what we mean is that it can often be stigmatizing to label people by their circumstances that they would not necessarily use to describe themselves. So, for example, people typically don't describe themselves as I'm an at-risk, low-income, difficult to reach parent. But these are words that all of us have used from time to time in describing disparities. However, using person-centered language is not the same thing as person-first language. So we want to ask ourselves, is this part of somebody's identity, and how would they refer to themselves? Is this particularly important? This can be particularly important when we're talking about disabled communities. Some may say, I'm disabled as a verb. I'm being actively disabled by my society, or while others might prefer to use the term a person with a disability. This is where it's important to engage members of your community, because people might not agree on the same term that's being used. And that's okay. I think the recommendation is that it's important that we explain why we choose the language that we choose and what that means. So looking on the right, there's an example with the X of things that are not necessarily following this tip, and then the check mark shows ways that you might revise it. So instead of diverse children up in the X box, you would say Black and Indigenous children. Instead of non-English speakers, if what you mean is Spanish speakers, you would say Spanish speaking. If you say low income parents, but you're really talking about parents who earn less than the federal minimum wage, or whatever that eligibility is for your state or the program you might be referencing, you would use that. Similarly to being more explicit of the groups that you would include for marginalized, underserved, or minority communities. So the second tip is not centering one type of person as the norm. And for this, it's important that we're aware of our own sort of conscious and unconscious biases where we may assign positive and negative values to people and groups through what we choose to emphasize in our data and what groups that we use for comparison. So instead of using white children as the default without an explanation when talking about closing the achievement gaps, you can use the desired outcome, such as performing at grade level for all children, as the comparison. Acknowledging intersectionality is also something that's important to think about within groups. So we all hold identities. I am Black, but I'm also a woman, and my experiences are not shaped by one, but all of my identities, and thinking that that is the same for families and children that we're talking about as well. Comparisons can help us document disparities, but they need to be accompanied by context and solutions, which brings me to our final communication guideline, which is putting data into context. So one of the things that's important about putting data into context is that we don't want to force people to fill in the blanks about why or how an issue is happening. Including systems level context early and often is really important. So, I think a lot of people, we do a good job, and there's always recommendations about breaking apart data, but that's not enough. When data are presented without context, people will, as I said, fill that in with our own assumptions and our own biases, which may often be negative stereotypes of a particular culture or group, or individual differences. So, for example, racial disparities in school readiness could be seen as the education system not meeting the needs of all children, all students, or it could be seen as individual differences in intelligence or motivation. And then finally, we know that people skim. I skim. There's a lot of information out there. So it's also important to include how and why throughout whatever data that you're presenting, because it's going to be hard for people to support solutions if they don't understand what the problem is. A recommendation that we share from the Frameworks Institute is that you want to explain how something happens before you start talking about who it happens to. So next, let's take these concepts and apply them to some of the data in the Bright Start dashboard. So first, just thinking about the concept that many of us, including myself, have used in terms of this idea of closing the gaps. I think one of the issues that can happen with this idea of closing gaps is that it may not be fair to all of us in that it's telling groups that we need to be by like other groups that may be doing better rather than having a universal goal that we want for all children. So I'm going to take an example from the dashboard on the third grade math and English language arts proficiency score dashboard. So in this example, we have third grade English learning arts and math proficiency scores for all children if you look at the first table in blue, followed in alphabetical order for American Indian and Alaskan natives in orange, Asian in gray, Black children in yellow, Hispanic in light blue, and then white children in green. And we have the English learning arts on the left, and then the same percentage of children that are proficient in math on the right. So in this instance, you may describe these findings as Asian American students having the highest percentage of children scoring proficient on math and English learning arts compared to other groups. What this communicates is that Asian students may be doing better on this measure than other groups, but by comparing the groups in this way, it ignores the fact that only 68% and 74% of Asian students are actually proficient in any of these given areas. And overall, it doesn't consider in-group differences on how children may be doing. So when we're communicating data, we want to make sure that we're also explicit about the goal and not just using where children are as the sole point of comparison. And that also helps in thinking about solutions, progress, and like moving forward. So take this next chart, for example, that shows the percentage of babies born at a low birth weight by ethnicity. You see all children in dark blue, then Black children in orange, white children in yellow, and non-Hispanic children in light blue. First of all, before sharing these data, we want to be explicit about the racial categories that were collected and reported and why. Because often, I mean, we know for some of these, we have different categories for different programs and reporting, and there are reasons for that. And I think, again, it's goes back to sort of saying what we mean and being explicit in who was being included in initial data and who was not. And for this, we want to set a goal to which the percentage of all children with a low percentage birth rate is as close to zero as possible. And what this signifies is that we're all trying to get to the same place. But as we're seeing, Black children are much further from that goal than other groups. And so the strategies and the interventions may look different in order to do that than for other groups that may be closer, but really thinking about what that overall goal is in the context of where children and families are. And that getting there requires understanding how we got here and providing context around factors that influence the measure of success is going to be the last strategy that I'm going to walk through. So my last example involves the measure of a success around school attendance, or the percentage of children that are chronically absent from school. So in this snapshot, the percentage of preschool age children that are chronically absent. So looking at the dashboard, we see statewide at the top, 17% of preschool students are chronically absent. And in the table below that sorts the data by district, that this could be as high as 64% in, I think it's the West Tennessee district. So to be chronically absent means that a child who misses 10% or more of school within a given year. So let's say we want the goal for this metric to be less than 1%, meaning no child, less than 1% of children miss more than 10% of school days within a given year to ensure that they're getting the maximum benefit of the education experiences that they're in. But the next question is, how do you get there if we don't have context around why this might be happening? So I'm going to put in a plug for the Strategies Clearinghouse, which is also on the Right Start website, which is a good resource in providing context, which you can link to from each of the different indicators that are in the dashboard. In this case, I've shared some context from Attendance Works around chronic absenteeism, and why we focus on that versus just overall attendance is some context, but also thinking about the things that contribute to absences, such as health issues, barriers to transportation for families, and food insecurity. Without this context, one might propose to improve attendance, stronger truancy policies, which may not get at the root reasons for which children are actually absent. So these are just a few examples of applying the tips that I shared. I'm going to hand things over to my colleague Gabby to talk a little bit more about the next steps for the dashboard. And then I think we'll open things up for discussion and questions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Carlise. I am super happy to be here today. As Carlise said at the very start of the presentation, my name is Gabrielle Guerra. I am a senior research analyst in the Early Childhood Education Department here at Child Trends. And I also just wanted to say hello, neighbors, because I am based out of Durham, North Carolina, and it has always been super exciting to me to be able to work with Tennessee the last few years. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm going to review a few of our measures of success that have work in progress in various forms. As Carly said on the last slide, if you are interested in digging into more of the research basis for any of the measures of success that are presented in the dashboards, I highly recommend checking out the Bright Start Tennessee Clearinghouse, which is on the TQEE website, and that will also discuss some of the research basis for these as well. I've broken them into 3 different parts. I'm going to be presenting 2 of these sections, and then we're going to round out with Jonathan at the end, who's going to be talking about our measures of success where there are next steps currently in progress within the state. So first, I'll talk through our 2 measures of success where we currently have proxy indicators, those being the high quality childcare and education measure of success and the oral health measure of success. Then I will be briefly talking about what we've just called an aspirational measure of success, where we don't have data at this time, but it's something that we hope to include in the dashboard at a later time. And then we'll be rounding out with our 3 measures of success where there is data kind of on its way down the pipeline. So can you please go to the next slide? First, I'm going to talk a bit about our high quality early care and education birth through 5 measure of success. Our preferred measure of success for this indicator would be the percent of children birth to age 5 that are currently receiving high quality early care and education when not with their parents. So at this current moment in time, we don't have data available for the state of Tennessee. There are a few reasons for this. One of them is just the moving scales of quality that's happening within the state. The move from the 3-star system that's more heavily focused on safety and regulation towards the new Tennessee QRIS system, which has a more holistic kind of understanding of how quality is rated. But at the current moment in time, we just don't have that data at the county and at the state level while this transition is happening. But we do have a really good proxy that a lot of other states use as well. We're kind of assessing capacity in relation to the need of the local communities. So our proxy indicator for this specific measure of success would be the number of slots of high quality ECE relative to the number of children under the age of 6 with all available parents in the workforce. You can see in this little screenshot here that we've got 65% of parents that are in the workforce, but we're only meeting about 49% of the capacity. So that is still something that we can work towards work towards improving, even while we're also working to have better data around the quality portion of this. So we can go to the next slide. For oral health, our preferred indicator would be the percent of children without untreated tooth decay. This is just not data that's available at the state or county level at this time, even though there may be counties that have these data. So as an appropriate proxy indicator, we're once again kind of looking more at capacity. At the county level, we're looking at the number of licensed practicing dentists by county listed as a rate per 100,000 population. So this way we can still kind of get at, well, how many dentists are there per county? Are dental services available to children? Are there any areas that we can grow here? So even if we aren't able to talk about the direct health component of this, we can still talk about access when we're thinking about how we might be able to improve overall health for children. So next slide, please. So this is our aspirational measure of success, our positive parent and child interaction measure. Our preferred indicator would be the average number of minutes per day that parents talk or play with children. There are a few ways that this is measured and a few national data sets that do incorporate this, but unfortunately, those data sets do not break down to the county level. The main one that I'm thinking about here would be the National Survey for Children's Health. Tennessee we did try to address this by including this question in a parent survey that was distributed by TQEE, but after comparing this to the national and state level results that we already had, there was concern that those just didn't align as well as we would want them to. So we're kind of just thinking through what are some new ways that we can be extra careful about, not misrepresenting the data, but still getting at this measure of success. We kind of anticipate that there was this misalignment because the context around the questions may have been a bit different. For example, this question is typically asked with a few other questions at once. So it's possible that parents, if this question was in isolation, they may estimate the average number of minutes that they're doing this activity differently than if they were considering a few different activities and kind of thinking through the averages of all of them at once. So at the current moment in time, we don't have data for this one, but this is kind of an exciting place for Tennessee to be because Tennessee is at the forefront of this conversation, and this is something that is happening at the national level. Tennessee gets to be a part of the conversation around how can we best define and assess this indicator for children birth to age 8 in a way that also allows us to acquire the level of specificity of the information in terms of like getting it down to the county level to best support children. So now I'm going to pass it over to Jonathan to talk through our literacy related measures of success. And yeah, thank you.
Perfect. No, thank you. So we've talked about kind of the things that exist out there, the things that were aspirational, the things where we've used proxies, and then these are two. Actually, we've got one on the next slide too, but 2 or 3 things that we are working on trying to get better data at. And the first 2 are really covered under this literacy component because we hope to use the same data source in kind of retrieving and obtaining both of these. So 3 years ago, the state legislature passed the Tennessee Literacy Success Act, requiring school districts to use a universal reading screener. This is Tennessee. And so even with the requirement of that, we actually have a lot of flexibility and autonomy and choice in that. So there are actually 7 screeners that you can choose from. One that the state helps to fund a little bit with Ames Web Plus, but then there's 6 other additional screeners that are optional to be used by school districts. And so what we have been doing is we've been trying for a couple of years to get access to this data into the data source at a statewide level. But really what we're approaching now is going to be looking at trying to retrieve this school district by school district to find what this looks like, to take the screener that they use in the pre-K all the way through second grade, slots of grades, and then find that proficiency data and really try to extract that out and present that back. The thing we have to be careful with this is that as we present this data back out, is that this data doesn't necessarily translate across screener. So like one district that uses one screener might not be able to compare that against the other. So we have to figure out a way to kind of present that in a way that is responsible with data presentation. So stay tuned. If you're in a part of the Bright Start Network, we will be asking for your help soon, probably to be connecting to some of these school districts to help us to make these asks. We want to do as much as we can to kind of lower the burden on data requests from our school districts, but we have a template that we're in the process of building now and should have something ready to go for that. We'll use summer learning, the same thing. We'll use the same tools, looking at comparisons between the spring score and then the next year's fall score to kind of see if we can measure summer learning in regards to proficiency for reading. All right, next slide. Last one that has been evading us thus far, and we finally think we have a plan on this, and we're working on this. I've got a working group with some fantastic people with TECTA and CCR&R and Aim High, Tennessee, to help us to think through what this looks like. The first thing is that this is broken up into two different components. One, there's a DHS component of things in regards to licensed childcare, and then the other is a TDOE component in regards to schools that have been through the Building Strong Brains curriculum. And so with the DHS piece of this, we'll be looking at data that exists in the 10-PAL system, and that data would be looking at the number of curriculums and the curriculums that show and demonstrate use of the pyramid model within the training for DHS licensed childcare providers. And so what trainings have they been through? How much exposure to the pyramid model have they had? What does that look like as far as a bare minimum that we would hope to see? And then also looking at that to see what is the gold standard for what we would love to see every provider, childcare provider across the board using the pyramid model. And so then we'll take that and extract as much as we can the information from each childcare provider, not by place, but by person, and then look at the number of providers within each county that have been exposed to that threshold of pyramid model training as we look at this. Again, lots of nuances here, lots of things that you can see where we don't have the data that we would want to see, but we're trying to find ways to constantly push further into the data that we do have to get a better understanding of what these early care and education environments are within our state. So that is where we are on that one. And then I think I wanted to bring back, if you want to go back before we go to questions, I'm going to take privilege and ask a couple questions first and foremost, and kind of lead you guys with this. If you go back a couple slides, one of the things, or actually you don't have to go. We'll kick off the presentation for a second, and I'll just kick us out. So my question, I guess, to you is this: you've just kind of warned us against posing things as closing gaps when it comes to race and ethnicity. We still frame things and talk about things as closing gaps when it comes to economically disadvantaged students and those that are not economically disadvantaged. What thoughts do you have for us as we talk about it that way, in regards to not centering a single specific group out, but that's one thing that we've talked about across the board, that we want to support families that have that experience economic difficulties.
Yeah, I think I'll just add to that. I think in terms of when we talk about kind of closing the gaps, and I think often we talking about the achievement gaps, I think it's more of being careful about sort of not centering one group's outcomes as the goal, right? So that the goal is that now Black children should be performing the same as white or Asian children. That we're centering that around moving people close to a universal goal, but understanding that some groups have further to go. I think it's a difference, instead of kind of when you're looking at cross-group comparison, making sure that you're having that overall goal, because otherwise, like I think in the thing that we had, it's not showing that you still have like about a third of Asian students that are not proficient, right? So then it just to make sure that the conversation is inclusive of where everybody is versus where they want to go versus kind of what I have done before too, saying that, well, they're performing worse than this group, which maybe that doesn't center around where all children need to be. And that can be for economically disadvantaged children that may have an identified disability. I think for any group in comparison, I used race and ethnicity, but I think it's for like any group. And part of it's just more around communicating your message and then kind of what the solution is, but also what does success look like and what does progress look like as you're looking at different interventions and how that's moving you along any given indicator.
We've had, and I asked that question, a leading question on purpose because we use that language still sometimes, but we've had conversations in several of our Bright Start communities, hopefully all of them that have gone through the planning process, where we talk about targeted universalism, right? And the idea of like, how do we take no at some level, if we look at our students that are not economically disadvantaged, for example, that's not the standard or the goal that we're trying to shoot for. We want everybody to kind of raise up when their English language arts proficiency and their math proficiency. But it's at the same time, there are certain things that we need to provide as a targeted solution for students that may have different, exposure to different problems. So no, that's fantastic.
No, and
Another thing,
absolutely. And I think I was just
go
gonna
ahead. No,
say we've talked about targeted universalism in our other groups, and I think another key component of that is that you're seeing, like, for example, for low birth weight, like Black babies are like twice as much more likely to have a lower birth weights. Focusing on that population and services and policies by addressing the needs of that community, it can cause more inclusiveness and like lift all boats at the same time too. So I think that's the other idea, because I think often when we see these differences across economically disadvantaged racial groups, regions too, like so if you're looking at different school districts and communities, that has to sometimes that has to do with like resources, policies, the availability of programs in those areas. So I think going a little deeper and thinking about like what is being excluded from this group and looking at your program design and outreach based on that can help to improve for all children as well, is I think is another thing around targeted universal that we talk about, because it's a result of like the design or systems things that are targeted toward some groups but are not being supportive and or reaching all groups.
perfect.
Gabby, you
Connie,
had
I saw
something
you
like
had
that?
a question in the chat earlier about is there a template of questions that we should be using? Can you provide a little bit of clarification around what I might have missed what when that happened at the context at the time? But if you,
Sure. It was when she was talking about parent-child interactions and whether or not what we did or what I guess it's something that you all had done, Jonathan, around questions with parent-child interaction. So I was just curious if there was some place to go to get a template for that.
yeah, so that was, and I'll let you, Gabby, I know that you worked on this quite a bit too, but the we we took like several different nationally normed questionnaires and surveys of like types of questions for parent-child interaction, and then kind of boiled it down as much as we could to a survey that was part of our larger survey with our or our childcare survey that we use for the economic impact of insufficient childcare in Tennessee. We married those kind of two together, and as we did this, we had to kind of limit the space on that. So we only had like I think 5 or 6 questions, and those are on the dashboard. If you click into the information button, you can see exactly what we're asking there. But what we found is that didn't, when we got the results of that, it didn't nationally norm up against what we expected the answers to be. And so we didn't ever actually display that information. We made the choice to kind of hold that back and said, this doesn't fit what we thought, because when we were looking at the time use survey that we were comparing it to, that was framed a little bit differently in the way that that was presented. And so those two pieces of information or those data points didn't line up exactly. It's a great question though.
Hey, Jonathan, it's Lori with the Y.
Hey.
Hey, I would kind of be curious if there's something that CBOs could utilize for that early literacy piece, just because it's often difficult for us to get data from the schools with data sharing agreements and those types of things. if there was something that we could use as a universal screener, even statewide, that CBOs could utilize that would also align. The only thing I can think of right now is Easy CBM. That's also a free tool. Just thinking outside the box for other CBOs. If there's something that's being thought of in that regard.
Remind me, and this will help. I know you and I've talked before. Remind me what you guys use at the Y as far as the tools that you have. Is it Easy CBM?
Currently, we're using ECBM for our K through third grade. Outside of tutoring services, we're relying on district scores that we have in our 21st century programs, but we don't have access to that data for all of our programs that are not 21st century. So it would be great if there was a tool universally utilized across the state just to compare data from district to district, school to school, all of those things.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And that echoes the thing that we're hearing, is that people would love to see the access to this, even with the data that we are struggling to get right now, from the state. We're kind of now going to take the approach of district by district. Is this universal reading screener today? It's really not that universal, right? It's still, there's 7 different screeners that we're going to have to kind of figure out how they work together, or at the very least just show some level of proficiency by grade, by race and ethnicity and other statuses that we're able to pull that from. So I think you're echoing something where there just doesn't seem to be a solution yet, but I think that's something that we can continue to try to champion for sure. All right. That is it for today. I want to say a huge thanks to Carlise and Gabby for the work that you guys have been doing for the past 3 years. Been putting up with me on our regular calls. I enjoy the time with you guys. They're always conversations that kind of lead us to make the data that we have better, and to lead us to better presentations of that. And so huge thanks to you all for the support and technical assistance that you've been providing. And then thanks for the presentation today. So appreciate that. And thank you all. I'll stick on here if there's any other questions or anything like that for the next 5 minutes or so, if you guys have any outstanding Bright Start questions. But thank you all. Appreciate it.